Okay, so the reason that I started to put together this shade and shelter presentation, and sometimes it's been field days or night meetings, was because in about 2014 we had some quite extreme weather. We'd had some weeks of 40 degrees and we were getting lots of reports of animals through our animal health staff, not having adequate shade and shelter. And I started to look around the landscape at all the wonderful landcare type plantings that we had and really question whether they were doing what we wanted them or what the landholders wanted them to achieve for them on their properties. And at the same time, we were really looking at a landscape that had been influenced by quite an extended period of drought. And in 2001, we'd actually had some reports published for the Springhurst area that demonstrated a 47% loss of vegetation in that Springhurst area over a 29-year period. And those trees that were left standing were considered to be in quite decline. So if you think about that in 2001 and then what all that start of the millennium was like, it'd be interesting to see what the condition of those trees were. So I was really aware of this asset that we depend on of isolated paddock trees for shade and just how long we would still have that in the landscape if we didn't start to change what was going on. I was also quite aware that shade and shelter is not necessarily about the extremes. It's not about the snow, it's not about the 40-degree days, but it's about that fluctuation that we experience. And some of the most significant stock losses that have happened in Victoria have actually occurred in December, and they've occurred primarily in sheep when they've been shorn and then we had a drop of temperature. So it wasn't necessarily those 40s or those falls, it was when we've actually experienced quite a significant change from one day to the next. The other thing is, it's quite hard work to put this shade and shelter into our landscape, and I've added a picture here of a rhinoceros in the Canberra Zoo because I thought that if they could protect the odd tree from a rhino, then no matter how interested your livestock were in the tree, maybe there was some things that we could be doing in the landscape. So that's just a thought next time something happens to that fence line about the challenges it must be to keep a rhino away from a tree. Okay, so I'm sure many of you have got experience in shade and shelter, and I guess what I wanted to do with this presentation is really break it down, look at what you might have now, take a whole farm planning perspective, look at things a bit holistically, and then maybe go back out and have a look at what needs tweaking out there. So some of the benefits of whole farm planning, benefits of shade and shelter really come back to that whole farm perspective. And we can look at things that are different values for different people. And there's actually a really good document that another Landcare network kindly put together around the benefits of shelter belts, and I can read out lots of things, and I've got some statistics and research in this, but if you would like to have a look at that document, that sort of brings together lots and lots of years worth of research. But some of the types of things that we're looking at, and the numbers tell us that about a 15% increase in property value where the property has shade and shelter. Research in Western Australia shows a 20 to 30% reduction in evaporation off dams where they're buffered by areas of trees, not up against them, because that will cause you more problems. But that's quite a significant amount when you start to look at our rainfall patterns, and as we move into more variable climate, any water we can retain in our dams, especially those that have been created at a time when we might have had more reliable rainfall. Then there's things like aesthetic values of, blocking out the neighbours, lots of biodiversity, habitat values, but also any of those possums and birds that come in and live in those shade and shelter areas have a direct benefit to the insect, or reduction of insect populations in those pastures. alternate industries such as firewood or seed collection, and things like biosecurity buffer from the neighbours, so your stock are not nose to nose over the fence. As many of you probably know in this area, benefits of salinity and erosion, fire breaks, and also lots of animal health and productivity benefits. You can really see a direct cost and production benefit where properties have shade and shelter. These are some of the, I guess, production statistics. I could read through them, but I won't. I'll let you get the gist of this, and I have a copy of the presentation that you can take as well. And there's lots of things in the report. But I guess one of the things that sticks in my mind is things like twin lamb survival rates, considerably higher, and some of the research that was done by AgVic at our Rutherglen research station found that 70% of sheep will actually seek shelter for lambing, and especially where there's multiples, that second twin will actually stand in half the time where it's in a sheltered environment as opposed to being unsheltered, and that is really critical to be able to stand and drink because of they're having such a low birth rate. So some of those types of things are really clear production benefits where you're getting that higher survival rate. Okay, so I'm going to break down what is shade and what is shelter. So shade is really about intercepting the sun's direct rays, and you can look at natural or structural options. When you look at the natural options, you also encompass so many more of those other multiple benefits that you can gain. Some of the more built options, I guess you could say, require a little bit more engineering and thought. They can go horribly wrong if they're not allowing movement in areas, but they do provide a really great option where you're starting with not a lot. These are some of the pictures taken by some of the other staff when we've been looking at stock containment areas and protection of stock during drought conditions. So there's some innovative landholders out there trying to provide some options, but quite considerable cost and maintenance to go with something like that, as opposed to natural options where you get a greater multiple benefit. They do seem expensive when you go out to put up that fence, but longer term you get all those other benefits as well. So principles for shade, looking at your orientation, providing the greatest area of shade in the afternoon, and are you or your neighbours getting that shade? So we have a tendency to plant on our boundaries to block out the neighbours and get all those other benefits. But if you're looking at that cost benefit, it's who's getting that type of benefit. So some of the design of shade and shelter you can get quite effective from clumps and isolated paddock trees, although there's that caution about fencing out beyond the root zone so you're not getting that compaction and camping underneath the trees, and get that longer term survival, and also about putting the feed or drinking water away from those areas, and provides airflow. So shade is really needs that airflow to be able to allow animals to cool and not be too densely compacted. So what's shelter? So shelter is quite different in that you're really trying to reduce that wind speed, and by reducing that wind speed you're improving the temperature conditions. It really is that conventional trees and shrubs and diverting your winds type model that we've seen for some time. But I guess one of the things that I really wanted to highlight tonight was that it doesn't actually have to be a tree belt. Shelter can actually be provided in lots of other ways as well. When we talk about shelter belts, we do talk about long areas and that density of shrubs and trees, but I've got some other thoughts to share as well. So some of those are that shelter can So for every metre high, the wind will be reduced for 3 metres away from that area. So even if you have a 1 metre high shrub or a tusky grass, then you're actually reducing that wind speed or improving that temperature for 3 metres away. So there's lots of shrubs and grasses and things that can provide that sheltered protection. And so where you haven't got the area or the time or the money to be creating a big shelter belt, there is lots of other options. And I did decide that the English and their hedgerows might have actually been onto a good thing some time ago, in that they were spacing them out quite regularly and reducing that wind speed and providing that environment. So some of the principles for shelter. So if we go back to the research that was done in the 70s and the 80s, they actually talk about a minimum of length being 10 times the height, and that's because of the research that they did found creating diversions and wind tunnelling around areas. So some of the research indicated short areas or where there was some gaps could create tunnelling. So I guess it's having a look at your property, where the prevailing winds are, the size of your property and those type of things. But that's just a thought. And also that maybe multiple options across a paddock are a better option than one large area. Multiple rows that are 2 to 4 metres apart and have a density of 40 to 60% is what they say. And I'd really love to see what 40 to 60% is, but if you look at that as being a reflection of the remnant vegetation of the good structure of understory and trees, and that you're not trying to block all the winds. You still need some movement, so you're not creating diversions. Consider repetitive patterns, have a mixture, and be practical and used by your stock. I think that's the key, what works best on your farm. So if we start to look at some of the design concepts, consider whether it is that it's shade or shelter that you really want on your property, and what shelter do you currently have and can it be enhanced? What are the multiple benefits that can be achieved? So all those benefits that I put on the second page, they're all great things to have, but some of those might need some thought in any planning. So if you want to go into alternative industries, you need to be careful about the species that you're selecting and things like that. So think about those, and how will your shelter be managed? So some of the important design considerations is around insufficient shade and shelter, and this is where I guess some of the animal health staff and us have conversations, is that sometimes not enough, or the odd tree is actually worse, where you've got lots of animals camping. You can have a much greater animal health risk than almost as if they were forced to be out in a paddock. I guess that's just thinking through them all coming together. Turbulence, as I mentioned, frost zones. So there is record of where you plant along a contour. You're probably familiar with that on a motorbike through a paddock, and you feel those zones or where the frost is, that often if you plant along a contour, it can make some of those frost areas worse, which is actually sort of a negative to the whole type of thing. The importance of the weeds and pests, so if you've got something like phalaris, or the neighbour's got a really good collection of rabbits or something like that, those things are all just going to add to how can they be addressed before you might progress any further. And integrating it into your farming system. So if your sheep camp on the top of the hill but you put your shelter somewhere else, how is it that you're going to manage that animal behaviour? Where are your pastures and your fodder? So if you've got paddocks that are locked up at certain times of the year, but that's where your shade is, then how can you match that timing of when you want to use those paddocks for critical need, and what pastures and what shelter you have, and match those. Land class, landscape and layout. So I guess that's all those things about Where are the high production value areas on your property and you want to keep those for your good pastures? Where are the areas that might be better off fenced out and planted to trees? How does that fit with laneways and accessing tractors and things like that? So it's sort of bringing it all together. So I'd like to go back to a principle about revegetation, and it's really about protect, enhance and restore. And so this is a great way to look at what you have now, protect it because it has a pretty high value as biological and production, and it also can mean investing small amounts of money and then moving out to those newer areas. So it's protecting what you have, enhancing what might be a few old trees or an area along a creek, and then as a last resort look at going and planting those new areas. So this is sort of a bit of a whole farm planning perspective and a principle around revegetation and protecting our biodiversity assets and possibly saving on some of the dollars as well. My slide is in the wrong spot. So I guess these are just to summarise some of the considerations around orientation, where you want your shade to be, potentially not in the neighbour's place, looking at the height, the length, the density, the number of rows. All these types of things can then come together to create what you want. And I guess it's standing in each paddock or looking across your farm at each of these elements to see, and species composition, because that's probably what most people like. And so there's lots of different options as well. So once you've just made all these decisions about what you want it to look like, you sort of might want to concentrate on what types of plants. And so there's lots of different things, starting with the ecological vegetation class. So what's here now, or what is likely to grow best in your area and to ultimately have the best biodiversity benefits. But there's also lots of other options, and especially when we take a production focus, is there fodder options, is there introduced and deciduous options? And for a very long time I was in roles where we had to talk EVC and we didn't go outside of that, and I still firmly believe in that being, you know, the greatest biodiversity and great survival rates. But where you have things like laneways, yards, drives, things like that, there's all these other species that you could use on your property that can be an advantage in those areas where you may not want a great big row of gum trees or understory. So there's lots of other things that you can look at as a whole farm perspective. And then down the bottom I've got a few things more so to avoid, and that's some of the toxic things, the prickles and spikes not too close to the fence but on the inside. Some things are weeds. Weeds are, can be native things too that are not where you want them to be. So, and you also need to think about that mouldable benefits and growth forms. And I do actually have a list here of that I've taken from the Gold and Broken Re-Veg Guide that actually looks at tree form for shade. So while they are native species and many of them are EVC to here, they've actually looked at which ones have that form for shade. So, okay, so I'm sure that many of you have seen these profiles before, and Sally can help out. And I actually have the website for the northeast one too, which I think you were missing. So looking at, you know, what is in our landscape, and there's more and more discussions about how do we adapt to climate variability. And we were talking about this the other day at a field day, and I said, you know, maybe have a look at you know, things that might be growing in different parts of your landscape. So if you've got a drying landscape, what might have grown a little bit further up the hill or on those hills, and look at that. We don't necessarily need to look at things that are hundreds of kilometres away. Many of these species have quite diverse ranges. So implementation. So some of the tricks is to always have a gate, because you can guarantee the minute you put the fence up, neighbours' stock or your stock will be in that area. Soil preparation, weed control, pest control, all things that are best done well in advance, and not to rush out there and to be done at short notice. Spend the time and the effort and get it right, and you'll be rewarded by the longer term outcomes. And ordering your seeds and plants well in advance, and to guard or not to guard. And I think we're going back through a phase where to guard more and more. I think we may have seen a few good years, but everything from hares to birds are nipping everything off again, and it's a lot of work. So yeah, we did have a while there where we could get away with not doing anything. So what can shade and shelter be? So I'm just going to run through, I guess I get the advantage of going onto lots of different farms and seeing lots of different things. So I've put together some photos of different options. So shade and shelter can be blocks, clumps, corners, corridors, individual trees, hilltops, laneways, maternity paddocks. And it can be trees, shrubs, grasses, artificial, it can be combinations of everything. It's what works best for you and what works best in each paddock and holistically on your farm. So blocks. So this is actually a firewood plantation. Has anyone here got some of the firewood plantations that were done? These have evolved over time. Initially, they were lots of local eucalypt species that were being grown for firewood, and have progressively over a few years ended up with a little bit more understory plantings in them. But they were areas within proximity to Wangaratta, and went up to Chiltern and Indigo Valley as well. And these would be 15 years old, a lot of them now, so I need to go back and get some new photos, but great opportunity where they were spaced out and allowed a bit of pasture growth underneath, but really good opportunity to put stock in there in times of critical need. So most of them were about 3 hectares in size, so not many people are going to have a big patch like that, but that's just an example of a block. Clumps or corners. So bringing some of those areas of isolated paddock trees together, or taking advantage of creating corners where you can have wind protection from multiple prevailing winds. I guess that's knowing your own property and where the winds come from. Corridors. We used to have lots of these across landscapes. The picture down the bottom here is where they created a narrow corridor and then went back some years later and actually planted to make it a bit wider. So corridors are certainly what we see a lot across our landscape and think of as a bit more traditional shade and shelter. Individual paddock trees. And this is what there's been a lot more work on in recent years, and there's lots of ways to fence them to try and encourage regeneration and also to protect them. And so hopefully we see them in our landscape for a whole lot longer. And the one down here is fenced with an electric fence. So something that's not too permanent and hopefully not too expensive in the scheme of things. And maybe the right season, sometimes the season's right and that can happen and be slightly more cost effective than going out and planting. And lots more examples of almost rhino-proof protection of paddock trees. Hilltops, I guess protecting some of those areas that are not necessarily as high production, and also in northeast Victoria a great way of reducing groundwater recharge when it's an issue, unlike our current climatic conditions at the moment that tend to see not a lot of groundwater recharge, but a really important tool in this area in wet years. And great biodiversity links across landscapes as well. And paddocks, so where we've got trees a bit more spaced out, and the one up the top is actually at Rutherglen on the research station there, and you can see actually how the trees have grown up and there's no understory or any lower level, so the wind can just howl straight through there. Great for shade, but it's really lost that value as shelter. Whereas down the bottom with the lambs, that was actually a research project which occurred as part of the Evergraze project in the 2000s, and they saw significant survival rates of lambs, and they used in different, I've got some photos of it further along, but this was tall wheatgrass, which was originally used on saline sites. It's now actually a declared weed, so we can't plant it, but it was really great example of how a tussocky multiple road species can grow and provide quite adequate shelter. It was sown with perennial ryegrass, I think, in between it, and then they just delayed the grazing by mowing it. They did repeat the trial at Wagga using phalaris, but it was in the middle of the drought, and they actually consumed the phalaris, which is a whole lesson. And I don't know if I have another photo of what they did to redeem their research, so I'll show you that in a second. But this is some more sort of paddock scale plantings, and this was what they did. So they actually put hessian out, to try and improve the survival, but it did not. I have to chase up the numbers for you. It was something like the survival rate was something like 10 to 15% better in the grasses than it was with the hessian, something like that. So I can have a look and check. But and I guess this other picture is about looking at what other resources that you have on your farm, and sometimes thinking about the value of bales. And I have seen a property where the landholder had actually lined them up underneath mature trees and been able to use that. And it might not be that you want to store all your bales under your trees for an extended period of time. I'm not sure of the impacts on the quality, but for a period of time of critical need, if it's going to mean a bit of protection, then assets like that can be really quite useful. Okay, so shelter belt management. I guess if we think of an area of shade and shelter being a bit like your best lucerne paddock or a high value crop, it's not something that we can just fence out and hope for the best and it'll grow and it'll look after itself. So I guess I just wanted to highlight the value of that replacement planting, and especially in the first few years, because if you miss that replanting, you'll often see those spacings where things don't survive, and that will mean a long-term structural loss and potentially tunnelling. So don't expect that high survival rate in the first few years. Do less over more years and build that value of the area. Exclude the stock until well established and never leave the gate open. But equally, there was a time when we would shut the gate and we'd never let stock into areas, and then we end up with lots of weed problems and other problems. So the value of grazing these areas, and I think it's really about identifying times of critical need, as I say. So when can they be put in there for a short period of time so you will get a great benefit? When can they graze an area for a short period of time, reduce the fire risk, reduce the weeds? I think they're all valid things that make these areas more usable to landholders, and that's that point about grazing management. That we're in an altered landscape. These areas have been grazed, so we need to not just stop doing something. Weed control, and I think this is especially where we've got in really invasive things, or good old high value phalaris is great on the other side of the fence and not in your tree belt. So just getting on top of those things, and thinning and fallen timber. And actually Sally's got some really good stuff that she shared the other day about that. And sometimes we get natural regeneration and we get some very horrible growth patterns that are not going to do a lot for shade and shelter, and sometimes we really need to manage these areas. With the firewood plantations, we did a survey of landholders and what they intended to use those areas for when they got to about 10 years old, and many of them said, oh, they weren't going to harvest, they just wanted to keep them as natural areas. They'd seen lots of benefits, or they were going to just use the fallen timber. And in talking to some of the biodiversity staff, they actually said, well, that's actually the worst thing they can do, because some of that fallen timber is actually creating better habitats. So it's that balance between cleaning up an area, using the firewood, and sometimes thinning or selecting trees might be a better thing to do than take out all of that fallen timber. But you can guarantee that if you put those trees or that fence close to the trees, then you'll end up with plenty of fallen timber on the fence line that'll keep you busy anyway. So some of the key points is shade and shelter is essential for animal health, but there's also lots of other benefits. It's something that we know and can see as people who care about animals and the benefits. Understand and identify the times of critical need for shade and shelter, and in a second I'll show you some websites and things that can help with that. Identify your outcomes. Is it shade, shelter, or is it shade and shelter? Take a whole farm approach. Protect, enhance and restore and plan for multiple benefits. Design with management in mind. And shelter is a long-term investment, so manage it as an asset. And I guess for me, I didn't say at the start, I guess I've been with AgVic, or various name versions of AgVic, for almost 20 years. And I started out as a salinity extension officer, and we were planting high density trees, 1,000 stems to hectare, and we were putting them in straight lines and on hilltops. And then we had money for biodiversity plantings, and we were planting corridors across the landscape, and we were doing tree orders of 160,000 plants a year to be able to give out to people. And we did firewood plantations, and then our focus changed about being able to do that, and it made me realise what that used to mean to give people a tree and to be able to go out and see the difference that makes in the landscape. And so I put that point there, is to think about what you're putting into the landscape and making a difference for generations, not just for the odd happy cow or sheep. So value what you do, because it's really important and it is an asset for future generations. So just a couple of tools and resources, and I've got some bits and pieces here. Making the most of shade and shelter on your property is sort of a checklist that I've put together about standing in a paddock and looking at what it is that you might have and what you might need, and how you might make it what you want it to be. So that's one of the things. The Macreadie Landcare Group has some good stuff on their website, and the Gecko Clan's also done isolated paddock tree projects, so there's some good points to refer to. And some of the climate tools. So one of the other things I've got here is a chart. And so when we talk about impacts to production, livestock actually have like a happy temperature, which is like anything over about 27 degrees starts to get outside their range, and I think they're happier at a bit cooler than that. So this is actually interesting when you think about how many days over 30 plus we have, and how then that impacts on production. And when you add humidity to that, that actually gets much worse. So production can be impacted at a much lower temperature than we think. So identifying when those times of critical need are, there's the Bureau has an ag section which has some tools and things, and I'm sure you've all got your own apps and warnings and things like that. Cool Cows, so this is about the dairy industry, and they've put together information. You can actually register and they'll send you information about weather, and they also have some case studies and look at shade requirements. There is Agriculture Victoria has the Break and the Very Fast Break email newsletters that our climate guys put together with some forecasting of some of the seasonal conditions. Not quite the warning you need for 3 days' time. That comes under a different section. There is actually some text messaging trials that have gone on in the department to give out longer range warnings. So where the Bureau will tell you with a stock warning for tonight or tomorrow, they're looking at sort of 7-day modelling and things like that. I've just put this here